didn't know what they were.
Okay, if it's not a final, just the more you have, the more we can comment on.
All right, I think we're gonna get started, so we have enough time to talk about this paper, which, having read it, I expect we're gonna have a really, really wonderful conversation and discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Sovacool, who is the director of the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability. He's a full professor there at BU, who, see if I get, I'm not gonna try to go through all the things this time. But he works in areas of energy policy, energy security and justice, and building adaptive capacity to climate change. A few things that are really fascinating. He was a lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which you all know obviously what that is, and is the author of too many articles, briefs, and book chapters and books to count, including in journals like Energy Policy, Nature, a few you might have. A recipient of a wide range of honors and grants and awards from the NSF, Rockefeller, MacArthur, among other also well-known foundations. So it is really a pleasure and a delight. You've asked me to keep this introduction short, so I'm going to do that. Title of the talk today, the Low Carbon Risk Society, Dilemmas of Risk Trade-offs and Energy Transitions and Climate Policy. The normal rules apply. Grad student gets the first question. I will keep the in-room queue. Maybe Scott, if you can help me with the online one, that would be great. Or Luna. Maybe Luna can handle the online chat. Without further ado, Dr. Sovacool, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So it's a real. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was telling some of the organizers that I actually met Eleanor Ostrom twice before she passed away. And she's actually one of 5 scholars that I put on my slide deck about who inspired me to actually do research the way that she did, as well as to be the type of mentor that she was. So I think she still has an impact even now, so many years after her death. And yeah, that's partly why I accepted, because I couldn't say no to the Ostrom Colloquium. I have a bunch of affiliations, so I have to do this kind of obligatory slide. This is our Institute for Global Sustainability. It launched last year, which is a bit frustrating because, sustainability crisis, and they're launching it in 2023, a little bit behind the curve, but we're trying to make up for it with gusto. We focus on planetary and environmental health. We focus on energy systems, supply side, demand side, and we also focus on governance. So this notion of polycentrism is something we really part. And then every time we study one of these things, we try to focus on equity and justice. We try to create original data sets, do good data analysis, and then we try to have actual impact with city planners, with states, with governments, or with civil society groups, or with corporations. And then finally, just to give you a sample of what we do, we have a project we won with the Department of Energy looking at the community energy justice impacts of offshore wind in New England. We have a grant from the Sloan Foundation, which is renewable energy justice from different perspectives: indigenous, anti-racist, feminist, and anti-colonialist. And we have a very large grant from NIH at climate change and health, including maternal health, mental health, youth, even gun violence and heat waves. So that's a little taste for what we do. Now to the good stuff. So I wanted to start with what's not in the paper, and it's actually why we did this paper. That is, I have another grant called GENIE, which is the Governance of Negative Emissions and Geoengineering in Europe, where we came across the use of this word risk trade-offs in a National Academies report about carbon removal, things like biochar and enhanced weathering, and geoengineering, scary stuff like modifying the climate with aerosols or like ocean fertilization and so forth. And we thought it was a really cool term. And we wrote a paper based on 125 expert interviews where we found when you deploy all of those 20 technologies, sometimes you create a solution, if you make the technology more affordable, only by unveiling another risk that limits the incentive for corporations to invest, because if it's cheap, they can't make money. And we went and saw no less than 12 of these damn risk trade-offs across institutional and governance dimensions, technological dimensions, and behavioral dimensions. And then drawing from these 125 interviews, we even found cascading effects where some of those risk trade-offs don't even have a trade-off between these dimensions. They cascade and affect other elements of the risk dilemma, like social acceptance, right? If you can't get something socially accepted, well, then it's harder to experiment, it's more expensive, it's slower to roll out, and so forth. And then finally, we tested this with field research in the Great Barrier Reef. I know, gosh, these horrible places. And when we visited the Great Barrier Reef, they're using 4 of these interventions. And we identified these technology risks that correspond with benefits. So it's kind of like no one is benefit-free, no one is risk-free. It's always this trade-off. You only have certain benefits with risks. And that's at the technology level. You also see them at the systems level here, where again, this weird thing of like, you can do reforestation, but that could put restrictions on how you deploy enhanced weathering, or you could modify reefs, but that could negatively impact things like land-based ecosystems if the species are invasive and they spread out. So very troubling evidence, but very weak conceptual theorization, right? So geoengineering options are one thing, right? We kind of understand that like sprinkling aerosols into clouds has risk trade-offs. And we didn't really get into the earlier literature. We found the National Academy's report, threw it in the paper, and that was it. So maybe we're using the term a bit unsophisticatedly. Externality, spillover, kind of, it's the same as risk trade-off. So the kind of motivation was, well, let's get away from geoengineering and let's get much deeper into real theory. And what about climate mitigation options? What about the real deal? What about the stuff that we really want to use at scale? And so we've taken 3 cases, solar energy, EVs, and efficient homes through retrofits. And the kind of central question is like, what risk trade-offs might emerge through there? And for those of you that haven't been paying attention, these will be really quick. Those 3 options are kind of the big 3 innovations that everyone thinks are going to make a difference. Solar and wind, well, solar especially, is growing at double-digit rates every year. This is even conservative. To put this into perspective, to 2050, we will go from 1 million battery electric vehicles in 2015 to 1 billion in 2050. That's 1 million to 1,000 million in our generation. And then efficiency, we still need to make major improvements according to the IEA. And again, all sorts of data. This is just from a few weeks ago. Renewables, especially solar, is now set to be the biggest source of electricity in 3 years. EVs have been doubling almost nonstop. And like the time it took to reach 1 million was like 6 years, and then 2 years, and then 8 months, and then 6 months. And now it's every 3 months EVs reach another 1 million users. And then we have the nice IPCC synthesis report graphic that says that actually the biggest 2 sources of emissions reductions we have are solar and wind. And all of these are based on efficiency. Many of these are based on either efficiency or electrification. And everywhere you see blue are the cost-effective options. Solar is the biggest single blue. So if you want to condense a very sophisticated report into like the overly simplified headline, solar PV is the best single source we have to fight climate change. And even on the demand side, we have a whole variety of other things like heating and cooling, and how we change energy consumption in the home can also have pretty significant emissions reductions in terms of gigatons. So this is all household practices. To say nothing of the huge role for energy efficiency going forward between now and 2050, where everyone is projecting electrification, changes in behavior, improvements in technical efficiency. And this is to say nothing, I'm a huge advocate of efficiency, even though I wrote this paper. My joke used to be, energy efficiency is the answer, what's the question? Emissions reduction, jobs, controlling excess growth, and so forth. And it turns out that the actual energy efficiency interventions that we've made, largely through retrofits, appliance standards, and fuel economy, are greater than any single source of energy we have today. Or you could say energy use would be 70% higher today. Without efficiency, it's hard to see here. It's easier to see replotting the same one. That's efficiency, right? So this kind of notion that controlling demand and improving how we use energy is probably the first fuel or a huge hidden resource. To then say nothing by like even in Europe, the IEA says they can even have a further 60% improvement with efficiency. And I know these are a lot of global slides. How about the US? Here we go. This is from 2023. You can see this is how we use energy here in the US, 51% heating and cooling. And that leads to a whole variety of other things that we can do as we retrofit our homes to hopefully be zero energy. This is from Massachusetts, probably similar to Indiana. And even more solar growth here. This is capacity additions from Rocky Mountain Institute over the next decade or so. And you can see yellow is solar. So the global trends hold true here. And this actually shows you where solar will be. Where's Indiana?
There's a white space in Bloomington.
But pretty much like every region, you'll see solar, right, adopted between now and probably, 2024. This is actually very rapid transitions. So that gets to the paper about why those three innovations really matter. And there's a lot of theoretical work at the top, mostly because I was learning as I was writing and I wanted to be more sophisticated. Risk takes a definition from the Risk Society of America. It's the chance of an adverse outcome to human health or quality of life or the environment. So at least it's a multi-definitional definition. And this is just the kind of, it can be many things. There's unanticipated events, right? Or events that may not occur. It could be, prospective versus retrospective. It could be probabilistic versus certain. It could be systemic versus catastrophic. So all sorts of different ways. We kind of took all of the above, a loose definition of risk. And we also in the paper started to get into different categories of risk, right? So some are natural, even though they could be exacerbated by human factors like earthquakes and floods, and some are technological like pollution. Some are biological, like disease transmission. Some are economic, like unemployment. Some are demographic, especially like dependency on certain things or aging populations, which change how they operate demographically. Some are political. If anyone's been paying attention, would maybe have a risk coming this year for the new administration. And some can actually be medical, like morbidity and mortality and disability adjusted life years. And then finally, we get to these notions of risk trade-offs and how they're transferred. And I'm borrowing from Graham and Wiener for their definition. Basically, it's addressing one risk by creating another, or the change in the portfolio of risks by an intervention to reduce a target risk. There's a target risk and there's an adverse risk. It's the kind of language that they use. And we've identified 8 ways that these types of risks can be transferred. They're called mediums or even media, like risk media, the media by which the risks are disseminated. And we talk about 8: air, radiation, water, pesticides. These might seem like a really weird split, but it's also based on the way the EPA is structured. So like we kind of just followed the classic legal way of which the EPA defines risk, wastes, land, and technology. And this shows you all of those mediums of transfer at work for coal, which is not in the paper. But it is useful at just kind of understanding that a single energy system has multiple impacts across multiple types of its supply chain with multiple scales, right? So it is a wicked polycentric risk generation system. And finally, we create this typology, which is from Graham and Wiener, and then also used by Raskoff and Revez, about types of risk trade-offs. This is kind of where I was like, gosh, our earlier papers didn't know anything about risk trade-offs because we didn't talk about any of this. So a risk offset is when the same group suffers a different risk. The classic example would be if you have a headache, you eliminate the risk of a headache by taking an aspirin, but it could upset your stomach. You're still the one that's facing that risk. Risk substitution is when you replace that with another type of risk. So let's say that you take the aspirin, stumble by opening the cap, fall down the stairs, right? So it's not really related to ingesting the aspirin. It's another different type of risk. And then you can also have risks that go to other populations. If you boycott aspirin purchasing, then the people making aspirin could be unemployed, right? Or let's say that there's a huge shortage of aspirin at the supermarket and there's a car accident trying to deliver it. That would be an example of a risk transformation because you've now replaced a medical risk with actual car accident injuries. And we do a lot of work in the paper. What we find is that most of the risk trade-offs aren't really discussed in the context of low carbon innovations. And also most of the risk types of transfers are treated as within one quadrant. So first of all, we do at least validate the different categories of risk and we validate the different mediums of risk. So those do seem to have a good explanatory fit across 75 examples we found in the literature. And then here is where we find that the typology holds with 75 examples. But it's really not problematic, but it only puts them in one category. So you have an example of risk offset, period. An example of risk substitution, period. And one of the things we thought we might find with our cases are, could there be transfers even between these? Could one innovation actually have all four types of risk trade-offs, which no one has yet hypothesized, to my knowledge. So the big part of the paper uses that typology to talk about the three innovations, and it's just based on desk-based work. We didn't do interviews or anything else, but there's still a lot of evidence about these. Like each of the sections has like 20 or 30 references. You can see for the same type of risk, we're talking for at least solar PV, it's energy security and climate change. And you can see one of the things, good idea of a risk offset, this is amazing. Study done at Virginia Tech by colleagues found with the control groups, they got utility data for the Southeast. Solar adopters consume 30% more energy per household after they adopt compared to a normal Santa Clara, right? Partly it's moral licensing. I've done my part. Partly it's money savings. And then they buy an air conditioner. We met in interviews in another project, someone who bought 5 Xboxes and 5 TVs because they got solar PV. It's clean, right? So, you know, examples of different types of risk could be the electrician installing. There's been dozens of deaths, people getting struck by lightning or falling off of roofs. There's also been interesting people like solar adopters are usually subsidized by general costs that are then spread across all consumers, including students, pensioners, the elderly. You know, is it fair? Because actually you're just passing systems costs, like they're subsidizing this household's ability to be resilient and low carbon. And then finally, you have some other issues like mining minerals. You need copper, rare earths, zinc, aluminum, and all of that, graphite, which in China could have very negative impacts, or forced supply chain issues where they have like the Uyghurs are basically put into forms of modern slavery to keep the price of solar low. Typology also holds true for EVs. Same thing, rebounds. People drive more. They think that their car is clean. They stop walking and cycling. You also then create different types of risk. Range anxiety is a term that people are kind of nervous about how far their car can go. My parents have yet to buy an EV. I don't own a car. So my parents are my proxy for this. They have yet to buy one because my dad is worried he will lose sleep if he thinks he can't get to where he needs to go next day. And then of course, automobility with EVs transfers risk. You need roads, you need parking lots. It kind of creates automobility norms. And you have whole types of other things, like if we do decarbonize passenger vehicles, well then, you know, you shift who's making EVs. A lot of the big automotive manufacturers will see disruption. I think we said 30% reduction in jobs because EVs are easier to make, they're a better product. And you have huge reductions among car dealerships because car dealerships get about 3/4 of their revenues from maintenance of conventional cars. EVs don't need the maintenance. So you're kind of hitting them, and no one wants to be a car dealer right now, right? You're kind of hitting them at the margins. Also, EVs take longer to sell, 2 or 3 test drives, 10 times as many questions. So the salespersons don't want to use them. Right? There's opportunity costs for there. So there's a good example of a different type of risk transformation. And finally, my beloved energy efficiency. Same thing, meant to be whole house retrofits. So this is when you're retrofitting windows and boilers and heating systems. And you could also include solar PV. So there is a little bit of relationship between the cases. And again, gosh, rebounds again, which is crazy. Let's also focus on long or uncertain payback periods. I'm in the middle of renovating my bathroom right now. It's $55,000 to do this in Boston. I had to do a net present value calculation. Is it worth the investment? And imagine trying to predict future energy prices, future labor demands, like getting stuff installed now, even 5 years later, is twice as expensive as it was. So it's kind of like, how certain are you that that retrofit investment is worth it? Very hard. And then when you do these energy efficiency upgrades, usually you have really good draft proofing. You like insulate the building so there's no air coming in, which increases radon exposure. And again, here we're dealing from a study that UCL did, a bunch of epidemiologists, 10,000 homes with measurable impacts in radon and decreased health among the elderly. And finally, you have these types of different populations at risk. When you do your retrofit, where does the old bathtub go? Where does the old window go? Where does the old heat pump go if you had one, or the old boiler? Usually it goes to a waste facility. And if you're really unlucky, it goes to Bangladesh or China or sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of those waste flows go. Basel Action Network, which tracks waste flows under the Basel Convention, put GPS trackers on a lot of waste shipments for e-waste. So this would be like solar waste and heat pumps, and found that 9 out of 10 didn't go where they were supposed to. They go to Nigeria and China, even though on paper they're going to Sweden or other places. So there's huge issues of waste and corruption and transparency and accountability. And of course, the goal of a household retrofit is to use less energy. You saw those graphs earlier, 60% less energy in the EU by 2060, right? That could hurt profitability of these utilities, which have made all of these investments in pipelines and the grid and are already facing, the utility death spiral with prosuming and demand reduction and decarbonization objectives. In the UK, 25% of energy suppliers have gone bankrupt in the past 3 years. Right, so now you're saying you've got to make money in an environment where you're selling even less. That does legitimately threaten the business model for many of those companies. So to go towards near the end of the paper, what we then say is we go back to the earlier parts about the typologies and the categories. Interestingly, and we didn't know this would happen until we did the review, these 3 innovations have all the categories of risk. So they generate risks alongside kilometers driven or kilowatt hours or energy saved. They also involve all of the mediums of transfer, which is also interesting. Which maybe signifies the complexity of our supply chains and how energy is a socio-technical system. And then finally, they suggest that we've got to get a lot better at risk assessment and start dealing with different components of risk because of these trade-offs. Because you don't want to go in front of a policymaker and say, do nothing. You need to get better into, well, some risks are greater than others, like species loss, death, and air pollution. Well, who is affected? How certain are we that they will be affected? How severe is the outcome? Are we taking into consideration vulnerable groups or omitted voices? And when will they happen? And what about the future? Right? And we also have all of these different attributes of risk, right? Which are qualitative, which you can't even measure that well, that may create different criteria that will be very local and place-based. So on the one hand, we're trying to give a framework for better risk assessment, but we're also kind of passing the buck and saying it's kind of disseminated and place-based and each community will decide this themselves. And what we lastly find is that it's a wicked polycentric nest of risk trade-offs. We do see the risks going across with all 4 of our innovations, all of the 4 types of risk transfer, offset, substitution, transformation, and so forth. And we also see it hitting all of the mediums, some of which are actually going back and forth between land and air, air and water, and between all of the categories, right? So the conclusion, the ultimate conclusion, which is not good, is, well, first of all, these technologies don't eliminate risk. They're not risk-free. They just move it around, space and time, that transcend these different dimensions. And then we've got no less than 3 methods of conveyance between the risk transmission types, between the mediums, and between the categories of risk. And what this ultimately means, and I don't know what we do with this, is that risk management becomes 3-dimensional chess. How we would ever manage transmissions of risk, the medium shifting, and the different types of offsets, I don't know. But at least we've now started to understand how they might be operating. And maybe this also explains why we haven't made progress to date on climate action, because there's always a risk. And with that, over to you.
Okay, I will keep the cue. Looking.
I'm gonna take notes if that's okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
please do. We have the first question, then I will keep looking around, but I have plenty of my own, so. All right.
The chair's not allowed to ask that question. All right. Hi.
I'm Beatriz. Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. So I'm thinking about kind of these different groups that are disputing the idea of decarbonization, right? And like I'm thinking, for example, COP28, the Ministry of Environment of the World said, oh, doing a decarbonization process in Colombia means changing the base of our economy too. So, or for example, right, the whole idea with like the South Road, the loss and damage fund, and also at the same time, the ideas of like false solutions in decarbonization and these other groups that are involved in this process, they're also saying the risks of this type of new technologies also mean more mining, and that also mean not land tenure. So I'm thinking like how much context, depending on which group you are assessing, that like influences this idea of risk. And if in the case studies you looked at, especially and the different technologies you're looking at, what context did you look at too?
Those are not easy questions. And it's troubling because I think a community could very well decide that they're comfortable with certain levels of risk distribution, and those levels of risk distribution are immoral or unethical. You know, there's great debates in philosophy about utilitarianism, you know, and there's a great book by Ursula Le Guin who's like, it's like a perfect society, but there's 10 people in a basement suffering all the time. But 100 people are happy. Is that okay? And I worry that risk management right now could be, let's say that Bloomington decided to go EVs because they get cleaner air and that's it. And then all the negative impacts are pushed around the world to the mines and the waste flows and all of that. So it's like, you're just, and you're okay with that. And who would we be to say, oh, you can't do it that way, it's colonialist, it's racist and so forth, you know, you gotta put your community first. So yeah, I think that it comes back to this notion of kind of those different dimensions of risk about place and time and severity. And I think one of the downsides to the framework is it will probably still result in conflicts. Like you could come together in Bloomington and say you want to do A, and people in the DRC say they want to do B, and they're exact opposite. But I think at this particular point, we haven't even identified them yet. Let's at least get better at identifying the risks before we then think about how we distribute them.
Yeah, I have this great talk. I have just a question on just this idea of the dimensions of risk you mentioned. Because I want to hear your thoughts on how this risk spillover framework thinks about the difference on risk, let me say, being endogenous or exogenous to themselves. Like, and I'm thinking you gave a good example on like the adoption of electric cars. And a risk that it entails of that strategy is that there will be shifting in the car industry as itself, so that will lead to some like outcomes. So that risk seems to be, let me say, endogenous, because that will happen. So there is certainty that will happen if there is a successful adoption of electric cars. It's more a question on the timing. It's like when it's going to happen. And there are other, but how at the same time there are other risk examples you gave that could be like conditional on the actions of other agents, that like it's not necessarily directly explained by the adoption of electric cars, but more like how other agents are reacting to that. So like there is uncertainty on whether that risk will materialize, and also there is uncertainty when it's going to happen. So I was just want to hear like how does your framework think about this potential difference in risks?
It doesn't at all, which is not to say that it should, right? Or that it shouldn't. I mean, I think notions of exogenous versus endogenous may be almost certain or probabilistically certain versus like rare, right? Would also, and scales, because they're happening at different scales. Like you said, the automotive industry is one scale, another scale is like the household, another scale is the community. So yeah, I think those are good questions that you could even add more dimensions.
Okay.
So, which you're free to do as we theorize about risk. Yeah.
Thank you.
So really nice talk, really enjoyed it. I'm Charlie Schweik. I'm actually from the University of Massachusetts Amherst visiting, so nice to see another Massachusettsian. I found myself thinking as you went through the talk about policy, and that second to last slide really got at it. I was thinking about in Massachusetts, we have a state policy of EV rebates right now. We're doing offshore wind energy. So I was thinking those contexts. In terms of policy analysis and kind of building from where you closed, is it possible to move toward, with the different data you were pulling in and things, some kind of dashboard decision-making system that would allow a state policymaker to kind of, okay, if we move this way on EVs more than offshore wind energy, what are our risk trade-offs? It just seems probable building on your framework to do something like this, and I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition that we could make that. I don't think I can create the dashboard, but we can suggest tools and dashboards or like risk registers.
Yeah.
Which could be neat. I mean, you have to probably train, I don't even know how to do one really well. I've like done them for grants that takes me an hour on Excel, but like proper risk training and proper risk registry assessment might be a really good recommendation. Do you think it would be only state policymakers or also
No, it could be
city?
any level for sure, but that was just the one I was thinking of as we're talking.
And I have a really silly question because I don't study public administration. Do they have risk criteria they usually use? What do they use?
Well, hi, I'm Brenda Bushhouse. I'm from University of Massachusetts Amherst too. And as you were talking, I was just having flashbacks to the big dig.
Yeah.
One of the first papers I wrote was about the 3-level chess that it took to take the elevated highways and put them underground. And for those of you not from Boston, but I was thinking of the risk analysis, and there's a whole field of within public policy that really looks at risk. And I don't have the direct answers right now, but the colleagues that I know that do this, it might be a nice connection.
It's James and then.
So I have 2 questions. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was fascinating, and mine are about human behavior more so. Maybe all outside the scope of your work, but you're more more knowledgeable in this literature than I am. The first question, which is the most important, is how much energy does an Xbox take? I have 3 children, and I want to know how much energy I'm paying Xbox. My real question is, do you find differences when people are actually like footing the whole bill of their solar systems on their houses versus people that get like, you know, some sort of, are signing up for a program where they're actually not paying for it, but they're leasing their roof space versus people that may have a state has a specialized program that pays for it. I'm curious what you've seen or what your knowledge is on like how people's behavior changes based upon the skin in the game they have.
Yeah, that's a great question. Not in this paper, but we reference a paper that we did on solar energy justice, where we did interviews in the UK with 4 vulnerable household and vulnerable community neighborhoods in the Brighton and Hove area. That's where Sussex is. And there we had all 3 of those approaches. We had some like social housing tenants. That's the term for social housing tenants who were given solar for free. And that was one of the Xbox guys who was like, I'm gonna buy a bunch of stuff because I'm clean, even though it turned out his solar panel wasn't working. And there was interesting because like the idea was, because solar is so easy and modular and simple, put it on these social housing blocks, you don't have to worry about it. But it turned out that like half the systems were broken, they were falling through roofs, they weren't being cleaned. So like we have pictures like cracked ones, all this dust on them and all that. So the lesson there is like giving it for free doesn't work. And when you have changes in who's at the house, the new tenants who come in have no idea. I don't know what it is. You know, is it solar thermal? Like, no, it's solar photovoltaic.
When we sold our house, I'd put like 30 panels on the barn, but the people didn't ask a single question about it. It's like, it's still working.
People didn't know, they didn't have any apps, they didn't, you know, so it's kind of like when there's changes in occupancy, we were giving recommendations to the local council. In the middle ground, those kind of people who were like leasing roofs, they had nothing to do with it, they just got a check. What was interesting there is that's where we identified some of these monetary rebounds. People are like, yeah, I'm taking my solar savings and I'm going to the Caribbean. Right, which will pretty much undo, I mean, good for them, right, for their mental health and going on vacation, but bad from an actual standpoint. And this is actually a colleague of mine, Steve Sorrell, does work on rebounds. And he even has a study that's called something like lights for flights, where people were using their energy light bulb savings and then purchasing flights to go around them, which is even worse because like lighting is such a small amount of household energy consumption. And then finally, for the people who didn't need those types of, they weren't solar leases and they weren't state-run programs, they just like, the UK had a feed-in tariff for a bit, they don't anymore, another issue, but anyway. We talked to 5 or 6 wealthy households who like just adopted it. And there it was weird. It was like 3 of them women who were widows, kept the systems for their husbands, even though their husbands had passed away, but had no input in the system at all. So it was kind of like they kept it there as a legacy to their deceased partner, but didn't really have understanding. To others who were like prosuming and doing real-time pricing and like really engaging in the spot market. To others who were having trouble with warranties and inverters. And so their systems were failing or were a burden. Three of those 6 homes that were wealthy, solar was a net cost to them. Because they had to upgrade or buy a new battery or had issues with the warranty. A lot of cheap Chinese panels that the companies weren't even there anymore 5 years later. So that's the whole gamut. It's like, that's like so many different types of adopters and types of risk at different types of consumers. And that's just through 28 interviews with households.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi, I'm Natalie Mendez. I'm visiting scholar, and I think my question is connected to the human behavior question, and is under what category would you include the cultural risks? And I'm thinking about, because I don't see like that those fit into any of these 7 categories, but maybe you have thought about this. I'm thinking about I don't know, in the case of my home city, that is Bogota, we have had a huge change in terms of electric vehicles and how I guess those are positive risks, right? Like the change of status of pedestrians and bikers now are good, they're more respected. But for instance, in Colombia, having a private car is like the same as like a status, right? But now that change, okay, I don't need a car to have that social status. I can buy a bike and you know, even contribute to a more sustainable mobility. So I'm thinking about maybe other places. Of course, this is context dependent, as you said, but I'm thinking about other contexts where those changes in the way we perceive energy or the way energy transition is conducted, maybe that might impose risk of cultural and tradition, you know, social norms.
That's a great point. So I cheated, and the 7 categories from risk come straight from another article. Right, because I was trying to like, how do I capture, like, how do you even get into different environmental risks versus technological risks? I think for her, demographic risks include culture, like changes in cultural practices or trends like digitalization and automation and all of that. But you're right, I may want to think about an 8th dimension of culture, or at least put culture into the demographic one. Good idea.
Because these are huge, like, you know, a massive changes of the way we perceive and believe and how we interact with other people. And I think, yeah, that's important. So it would be great if you can leave. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
So Gustavo next and then Tracy.
Oh, hi. Well, sorry, I cannot be there in person. Very interesting presentation.
1 second, Gustavo, you're not quite loud enough. 1 second, we're gonna
Gotcha.
fix the volume here.
Okay.
It's usually very loud.
There's time for everything, right? Gustavo's not loud enough. Here we go.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay, so very nice presentation. Sorry, I cannot be in person. So my comment / question is bringing some ideas from finance. So if you use notions of risk that people normally use in finance for asset pricing, what matters is a covariation rather than variation of the payoff of these assets. No, so and I think this could be very important in this context. No, so imagine that some of these technologies will be increasing unemployment in some sector, but other technology is doing exactly the opposite. So they are canceling each other. So they are not adding any risk. Okay. So I think using this more precise, a more theoretically sounded notion of risk could be very important for this project.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and it's somewhat similar to the economic risk, but I like what you're saying. I mean, it's kind of like net risk. Are they still worth it in the end, or are there still fewer risks not? And my sense would be, and this is one of the caveats I should put in the paper, I don't want it to be a reason not to decarbonize. It's like the risk trade-offs from fossil fuels are even worse, right? So you're right, but how the heck you tally up the risks in a simplistic. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
from finance, I think the key point is how things covariates with consumption, no? So essentially something that give you a very nice payoff in the middle of the recession is something very valuable, no? Something that give you very nice payoff when everything is booming, whatever, you don't pay much for that asset. You can use similar ideas here, no? So what matters is the covariation, not the variation of the payoffs, no, for risk. And by the way, it matters the whole set of assets. So you cannot identify the risk of any of these technologies without taking into account the whole portfolio of technologies that you are putting in place.
Was yours a two finger, Brenda?
Yeah, I was trying to do an email with my fellow grad student buddy from the Ostrom Workshop, Asim Prakash, who's an international relations scholar and I just sent him off an email because if anybody knows if this is being measured, I think it would be Asim.
He was actually just here in the fall.
Oh, was he?
I visited him last year as well at UW, so yeah.
Oh, okay. So you know,
Tell him I said hello.
And yeah, I think we had Joyce and then Scott.
Mine's just a little follow-on on the cultural question, and that is, so when I looked at the chart, under technology, it didn't seem to cover like cyber risks, like the whole terrorism, whether it's terrorism through technology or general terrorism, in all of the risks, it didn't cover that. And to me, that's a really big oversight. And as long as you're gonna throw in some more stuff, you might as well throw that in.
Leave it 10, right?
I mean, I think that would be a technological risk, but it's one that deserves explicit mentioning. Yeah,
Exactly.
privacy would be another issue
Yes.
in terms of terrorism. And we did another study on vehicle to grid and vehicle grid integration, looking at the imaginaries. And one of the dystopian imaginaries was some terrorist is gonna take control over all of your cars and threaten to kill everyone and crash them unless you pay them.
Yeah.
Right, and so there are potential scenarios where these things could be.
It's a Marvel comic.
Was really.
Last question of the day.
There was a Netflix movie not long ago that had a scene of all the Teslas being taken over. I use it in class sometimes. I forget what it's called.
Scott's
Yes, no, this was terrific. The security risk came to mind to me as well. So Joyce, thanks for raising that. I just had two really quick ones, just kind of very high level. One was to what extent those long-term trends that you pointed to are kind of baked in, despite maybe the geopolitical pictures that we're looking at later this year and next year in the EU, or there's global elections around the world, right? So I mean, I'm curious to what extent you feel like policy really could change those in a meaningful way, one way or the other. And also just second to the point that I think Charlie, and Brenda, you made too. I was just thinking about those local dashboards. Sarah, if you haven't already chatted, and Sarah Mincy runs the Environmental Resilience Institute and does so many cool things on like community work and these kind of risk management strategies. So I'm just wondering, I don't want to put you on the spot, but even after this, having a chance for you guys to get your heads together would be terrific.
Get her to come to dinner.
Good, do that.
Yeah, to the first point, that's great, and the second point, I do think that yes, learning more about the dashboards and how you could even conceptualize this might be good. There was a nice report called Risk Aware Electricity Regulation from like 20 years ago, but it wasn't it was like water risk, climate risk, land risk, wildfire risk. So it's kind of not quite what this is. To the first one, all of those projections, each one has different assumptions. I would be remiss if I didn't say that we are notoriously horrible at accurate predictions in the energy and climate field, right? So take all of those with a huge grain of salt. Right, just the past 5 years, right? None of the projections anticipated Russia, Ukraine, COVID-19, Brexit, or the Israel-Gaza war. And that's 4. Trump would be a 5th. Like, so it's kind of like, for now, based on how things are right now, that's how it looks. But the world could be incredibly different in just 2 years or 5 years. I hope a lot of those trends aren't undone. And despite the fact that I've just given you now 3 reasons to doubt solar, EVs, and retrofits, they still have huge co-benefits, right? And I'm guessing the net social risk is still reduced from them, especially air pollution, health, energy savings, jobs, and resilience seem to be net gains. And I know in Europe, if you monetize just two externalities, air pollution and fuel savings, the low carbon transition pays for itself. That's not even carbon, not even climate.
Yeah.
Right, so in that situation, I mean, I've also done studies on energy poverty that find that when you do those retrofits properly.
Yeah.
In low income homes, every pound gives you 35 pounds in benefits. And for improved cook stoves, it's 90. Every pound you put into an improved cook stove because of the gender and health. So it's kind of like, there are still huge reasons to do it. And there are a whole bunch of reasons to do it that have nothing to do with climate. So it could be those co-benefit framing around health, security, vitality.
I just find, is it okay?
Yeah, and then I think Sarah had a question and.
You okay? with it?
Sure.
Okay, no, I just find myself thinking about, would it be helpful to go back and do this type of analysis, thinking about the kind of dashboard idea to something that's happened in the past? So I find myself thinking about the ozone layer related things, and where there might be data that's like the outcome data, I guess. It's just a thought. And,
By the way, a huge risk trade-off there. We got off of CFCs, ozone depleting substances, and introduced a whole bunch of F gases that are even more potent for climate change.
yeah.
So we shifted the risk from, we recovered the ozone, but then have only increased radiative forcing. So it's one of the classic environmental unintended side effects of Montreal Protocol.
Yeah,
That's held up as such a success story.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I didn't realize.
but like modeling that out, when you have the outcome already, it might help as you're trying to craft something for climate. Yeah.
Sarah and then Brenda.
I'm sorry if I missed it at the beginning, but I'm curious if anyone has done this sort of risk assessment for fossil fuels. Because it seems to me that the comparison is very useful. You know, in terms of monetizing, that's one route to sort of try to come to some kind of conclusions about, well, then what do we do? But I'm also thinking about, I'm teaching some freshmen right now, and the paper we just went through was Bob Costanza's Visions for the Future. It's so old now, but it's so good, where he lays out 4 different visions of the future that are based on whether technology will save us, technology optimists versus pessimists. I don't know if you remember this. And he uses game theory and basically surveys people, which kind of world do you want to live in, right? And the whole underlining foundation is that we really have to vision together as a society to really make these kinds of decisions. We have to come to a conclusion about what kind of world we want to live in, sort of a normative, approach. And I'm just thinking about how this is really useful. So this is also a thank you for like laying out all of the risks, which I think some of us, Bill and me, work at ERI, we're always about EV, solar, yay, 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 right? It's just like really good to think about it critically and be able to talk about it effectively with skeptics, And I think it would be the next step that would be really useful would be able to say explicitly, we'll look at the risk assessment of what's happening otherwise, right? So yeah, the question is has that been done a parallel?
So I have not, and please, if you all see a risk proper study on fossil fuels, I mean, that would be phenomenal. In the 75 examples, there are a few that connect to like coal substitution with nuclear flips risk, right? Nuclear accidents versus coal mining, things like that. So there's a few examples, or air pollution, sulfur dioxide pollution control for coal. Basically moves it out of the air and then puts it into water and sludge. So there's a nice medium risk transfer. So I think there's some of the isolated examples but I have not seen an actual risk trade-off analysis or anyone that uses the typology. What we did a few years ago was a meta-analysis and evidence synthesis of externalities for energy and mobility and efficiency. We synthesized 30 years of work and about 700 estimations of externalities. And I think the findings are pretty good. For energy supply, the worst is waste to energy, coal, oil. Those 3 alone are like 80% of the externalities. Then you've got like a middle one of like big hydro, nuclear, and gas. And then it's actually wind, solar efficiency that are the best, and geothermal. And then for mobility, it's congestion from conventional cars is actually a bigger externality than climate change. Climate change is 3rd after air pollution. The other thing that's shocking is if you monetize those externalities using that evidence base, they're more than 20 trillion a year. And mobility is slightly more than energy, by the way. called roads and car crashes, which are also treated as unintended externalities of mobility. And what's shocking is that for energy, the externalities exceed energy sales. So it really implies the market failure, like the externalities are so great, it's greater than the revenues these companies are making. Or another way, they're only making those revenues because they can externalize the cost to us. And same with transportation. For a lot of the roads are public, right? Most part, we don't have a lot of toll roads. Efficiency was the only one that had positive externalities, net positive. So kind of these co-benefits, because efficiency creates more resilient systems, cheaper systems, controls demand and all of that, and correlates with innovation, then that was a positive externality. But yeah, I think that study is quite neat. Then we mapped externalities by region, China, EU, India, US. Of course, there's going to be a shift. Right now, most of them are EU and US, but by 2050, they'll shift overseas to the Asia Pacific. So we'll see a complete spatial geopolitical shift in where those are. But I think that's the best we've got so far. That's not risks, it's externalities, many different types, you know, from aesthetics and land use change to carbon to congestion and all that. And many different values. This is a critique we had to hedge in peer review, whether a study used willingness to pay or contingent valuation or input-output analysis, we just chunked it together. And whether the study was on China or Ghana or Saudi Arabia, well, we took a median. Because how else could you, right? We had to like at least get a sense, but yeah, like 7 cents per kilowatt hour for modern energy systems are currently externalized. And like, I think every kilometer has 15 cents of hidden externalities in where you drive. So.
Okay, I'm gonna do a lightning round, because we have a couple left, including some of my own. So Brenda, Simon, and then myself, and then the last word.
Mine is more of, just thinking about governance arrangements. So we tend to think about that these potential risks might be fixed in some way and we measure them at a certain point in time, but what are the kind of self-governing arrangements that could be possible? So I was thinking about a story I heard on NPR that was getting car batteries, the electric car batteries, getting the manufacturers of those to sign agreements that they would make them environmentally sustainable and with fair labor. And so I'm just, that's just something I'm thinking about. What are the self-governing arrangements? I'm also you made me think about how the utilities are, or the car dealerships, that it's not, these models of business aren't going to work anymore. And so it made me start thinking about, okay, what are the governance arrangements that we need to be thinking about in this new world of decarbonization? So the bigger question, so sorry.
Yes, so hi, my name is Simon. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the law school. So we learned about, I think, risk when we were studying artificial intelligence. And especially the EU, when they think about regulating AI, they sort of go from the direction of risk instead of sort of other ways. So the question is sort of basic, but maybe outside of the box. And so when we're thinking about AI and risk, I think the biggest difficulty within the European Union is about how you define high risk in comparison to other levels of risk. And I've been thinking, and through this talk, I've been thinking about how can we square that with sort of your risk trade-off analysis. I understand in this paper you are borrowing some other papers about like the 7 categories of risk, but how would the different levels of risk sort of, how can we do like a proper analysis of the the different levels of risk, and then to think about the trade-offs maybe in that context on artificial intelligence?
Okay, so awesome. Some of took some of my ideas. A really quick evidentiary question about what it means to have these risks as they make it into your paper. You reference it, but I just want to make sure I understand. It was whether you could find literature that talked about those particular risks for that particular technology. Okay, that was just an evidentiary question. Broader question that kind of builds on what a lot of people have asked is about whose perception of risk matters. In part because one of the things that it seems like this is like hedging towards, but not there yet, is what does this imply that we do, right? In terms of how we make decisions about this. And I would imagine that it's not only about how people think about the risk trade-offs vis-a-vis these technologies, but also vis-a-vis the fossil fuels decision, right? The status quo bias there. But also whose perception is relevant, especially when you think about like policy change. And this makes me think a little bit about thinking about like whether particular kinds of risk are more visible, right? There's been a little bit of nascent work we talk about like mining, where people are talking about whether it's a immediate acute risk that's, there's gonna be a massive noise pollution that's right at the time the mining is happening. Everybody can hear it. It's visible, it's transparent, everybody's pissed about it, right? Versus longer term, slower poisoning of a population by arsenic, right? Whether it's visible for whom, does that then require that politicians act in particular ways, right? The EPA, whoever can get away with a lot of particular policies that may be more palatable to large populations for risks that are much more obvious, right, than others. And I didn't see if that was a dimension, sort of an aspect of dimension of your risk, but sort of like those aspects of risk shape whose perception matters, right? When you talk about like in terms of taking action. Okay. You have 2 minutes.
Short answers for once. No, I like your visible versus invisible risk. We had, I think, systemic versus catastrophic, but that's different. So I think I'll add it in. In the workshop, in my acknowledgements. Simon, I also like your low risk, medium risk, high risk. I think that's qualitative judgments that we can add into the framework, right? As well as the immediacy of the risk and the reversibility of the risk and things like that. So you're right. I think that might be a nice little initial scoring technique. It's not that sophisticated, but it's better than nothing. And I love the idea of self-governing, that it doesn't have to be policy changes. Maybe you're right. Maybe once we tell certain actors these risks, companies, firms, students, entrepreneurs will try to create these kind of self-governing mechanisms that will help minimize some of those risks, right? None of these risks are necessarily inevitable. Many of them can be planned for and mitigated. Maybe that's the promise.
Mitigation is what made the big dig so expensive.
I used it though to get here. So it's still working.
All right, well, we are like pretty close to exactly on time. So thank you for that. Let's do one final round of applause. So please feel free to continue with the questions, discussions, comments over Indian food in the next room. Which should be ready, and you can either eat in the kitchen area or bring it back here to keep chatting. So thanks everybody to join us. Oh, quick announcement. Thank you, Diana.
We're gonna continue discussing some of these issues next week on our colloquium. Giovanna Di Quito is our guest, and she will be talking about decolonizing our common future. So things that are connected in my head. I'm
away from
like
things.
All right.
Great.